a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Happy 4th of July weekend, everybody, and welcome to the interview room. We're so glad you're here with us this evening. We are very excited for our guest. You recognize both of these doctors, not from the post office, but because they are famous in their own way, and you're going to see why here in a couple minutes. As always, a big thank you to our amazing mods, Miss Sophia, Teresa M, Maui Girl, and Mimi J2. Without you, we could not be putting this show on. You're very much a huge part of the interview room. Thanks to our subscribers, our members, and our Patreon members. Without you, also for your support, this show would not exist. We only ask tonight that you send this around the world through your social media networks, and that you go buy the books of both Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Gary Brucato, and those links will be down below. So let me introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Ann Burgess. She is a renowned pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse, and Ann is one of the original Mindhunters. She's the author of A Killer by Design, Murderers, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. We have links to her books below. Trust me, go get that book if you haven't read it yet. Among her many awards and accolades, in 2016, she was named a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing, and by golly, she is a living legend. Good evening, Dr. Burgess. Thank you for being here tonight.
Happy to be here, Chris.
Thank you so much. And of course, in the upper right-hand corner, we all know Dr. Gary Brucato. He is esteemed and brilliant in many, many ways, not only in academia, but when you spend time just talking to him, you'll know exactly what I mean. And he and Ann together are like, I guess, two ever-ready batteries coming together that will run on endless energy. Dr. Gary Brucato is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and Victor Petrarca on forensic research. They have examined crimes such as murder, including serial killings, sex offenses, mutilation and dismemberment, and the insanity defense. That's always pretty fascinating. Gary is currently serving as a consultant on a grant-funded project by Dr. Burgess and Dr. Petrarca, analyzing murders involving asphyxiation by strangulation and other means. He studies, among other things, how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic versus non-psychotic persons. Gary is the co-author of the Columbia University Mass Murder Database, which is the largest mass murder database in the world. And you recently published some of those findings that I'm sure we can get into here in a minute. He's also the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. There also is a link to his books in the descriptions below. So first things first, get those books, because I'm telling you, if you haven't read them, then if you have read them, they're going to help you understand where these two fine doctors land within not only academia, but law enforcement circles around the world. They have trained thousands and thousands. And of course, Anne worked very heavily on the classification manual for crimes, and we're gonna get into that. But so the thumbnail, as I put up tonight, has three names on it. One of them is Kohberger. The second is Murdaugh, and of course, the third is Allen from the Delphi situation. So I want to kind of just set this up, and then you guys kind of massage in relationship to what distinguishes all three of these different personalities away from the mass murder model, and how does that correlate to the classification manual? And so, who would like to, start us off tonight? And by the way, if you're new with the interview room, just hit that subscribe button, and you're going to have an opportunity as we go along here to ask questions of these amazing experts, world renowned. So why don't we start with Anne, because my mother would never forgive me if we didn't go ladies first. So Anne, share with us some of the work that you've been doing and what you have done in relationship to our topic tonight.
Sure, happy to. The work was really with the behavioral science unit back in the 80s. It started in the 80s and into the 90s. But what was important is that they would classify the types, and we came up with 4 types under which we then would do subtypes. And I think this will help in looking at some of the differences that Dr. Brucato will get into. But the first one was criminal enterprise, and that's standard. That's usually it's a contract or there's money exchange or something is set up ahead of time. That's a criminal enterprise. Then the largest group is the personal cause, and that's where there's usually a psychological point to the motivation of the murder. And we had about 12 or 15 categories under there. And then the one that we worked the most on was the sexual. And that was because at the time in the 80s, there was this phenomenon called no apparent motive. In other words, law enforcement would go to a crime scene and they couldn't figure out, there wasn't anything necessarily sexual about it, but there were some things that kind of hinted at it. And that's really the category that we came up with as a sexual motive, even though it wasn't the more traditional type of evidence that you would expect. And then the fourth group is the group cause. Now, this is the one that could be looked at in terms of mass murder. We didn't spend a lot of time on the classification of that, always thinking that we would further develop it later on. But the one case that really we put in the book that turned out not to be a mass murder was the murder of it was a rape, not almost a murder, of a young woman in Central Park in New York City. And the thinking at that time was there was a group of teenagers and it was called wilding. They were kind of this wild group. Later, and that was a horrible case because the young teenagers went to jail. They were convicted, even though they didn't have obviously strong evidence.
That was the jogger in Central Park, right?
Yes.
That was the jogger. Yes, she turned out to be a member for months. They didn't even know what her name was because she was in a coma. But at any rate, she turned out to be a financial analyst, I think, on Wall Street. But at the time, so we really had to realize that category of group. But the group that I think that will fall into those cases are your gang cases. And again, as I said at the time, we didn't have anybody that was expert in gangs. And so we would need to really expand that. So those were the 4 categories that we had at the specific time. And I think it all started in the 80s with the term going postal. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah. But anyway, this was a workplace violence where and there's obviously still is a big problem with workplace violence. But that started in the 80s. And it was where the people were very angry at a specific group. it would be what we would call now a grievance. We've kind of got two categories now: ideological, where people have a lot of emotion towards a ideological group, like certain types of people, or a grievance, a specific grievance. In this case, this is where I think the postal worker felt neglected, or maybe he was let go. I don't exactly remember the case, but that was the going postal was kind of the start, of you will, of the group cause.
Interesting. So, with the three personalities that we have on the thumbnail tonight, right? I mean, one of them, obviously, who's been arrested right now, Bryan Kohberger, for killing the four co-eds. And then, of course, we have Alan and, Murdaugh. So I want to ask, Gary, what are some of the key factors and motivations that put these individuals into certain categories, such as mass murder incidents?
Well, it's important to understand that the definitions are based partially on the number of victims and whether there is what's called a cooling off period between victims. A cooling off period meaning a break, usually a month or more, we'll see between offenses. Now, we have to distinguish between what's called serial killing, right? Mass murders and spree killers. And then there are killings that involve less than a certain number of people, like where there's one victim or two victims that don't really necessarily fall into one of those clusters. So the very quick version of that is that a mass murder, according to the crime classification manual, is four or more victims. And in the definition that I have used, that is in the wider kind of literature, is three or more victims that are killed at the same time in the same location without a cooling off period. So that, for example, if you look at the Sandy Hook shooting, where Adam Lanza left had been previously at another location where he killed his mother, he's technically not a mass shooter, right? That is somebody who would fall under the category of a spree killer. Spree killer is at the same time, but in more than one location, with the number of victims you would see in a mass murder, right? And then serial killing, which is very, very interesting when you get into the definition, is the original definition that people like Anne would have been working with said that you had three victims that were separated in time by a cooling off period in the service of abnormal psychological gratification. So it was necessary that the person was doing it to play out some perverse psychological fantasy, like longstanding needs to level the playing field or to show sexual gratification or through domination, control, manipulation of people, or just pure ego or being on a kind of a perverse mission like the Unabomber, where there's no sexual element. But the problem is that the current definition, I'm always saying this, I'm going to soapbox about it, says you only need two victims separated by a cooling off period, and that's it. It doesn't have, the motive is irrelevant. So that somebody like, if let's say we were to look at Murdaugh. Now, Murdaugh, what you see there, she was found guilty, wouldn't fall under the category of a mass murder because there aren't enough victims in one place at one time. It would certainly be personal cause because he wasn't, cooperating with a partner to murder these victims, right? It was a domestic issue, obviously, right? And there was financial gain involved and power dynamics. That person, if we were to find out that he had killed someone else or orchestrated the killing of someone else before or after those murders by a month or more, he would then technically fall into the category of serial killer. People like Anne and me, we think of a serial killer more like a sexually perverse offender that's going around repeatedly killing people for sexual gratification. Now, somebody that becomes more interesting from that angle is, and kind of unusual, is Kohberger, if we think of him as a suspect, because Bryan Kohberger is accused of a mass murder by any definition, four victims in one place at the same time, although I am convinced, I think Anne would echo this from previous conversations, that he didn't intend four victims. He went in there probably to target one person or possibly two, and other people were probably in his way, unfortunately. But it turned into a mass murder. And I have found in my work that only about 11.78% of mass murderers will have previously killed or will kill again and become serial killers. But I think that the characteristics of that suspect are far more like those you would see in an individual that commits serial killing. That is somebody that I think Ann and I can talk about this, but I think we have spoken about that we would expect someone with the motivations we glimpse in that killing to be someone who wouldn't be satisfied with that offense and might need to kind of keep doing it and keep committing, let's say, offenses like voyeurism or getting a thrill through perversions of some sort. There, doesn't matter that there wasn't necessarily sexual stuff glimpsed in that crime, because there probably is something perverse going on in that individual, which is going to emerge. And then when we look at Allen, who I think we need to talk about because I have a lot of problems with him as a suspect. I hope we'll get to that. But let's just say whoever committed Delphi, I would be comfortable saying that. Whoever committed Delphi, again, I think falls into that category of somebody with a kind of sexually perverse motivation of a personal cause type, and who would be the type where we would suspect that there probably had been other offenses, because a person does not just, in one's older years, kill two children and, in the way that those children were killed, and they stop or they have never done it before, right? So we need to talk about that. But I think regarding motivations, what we see in the mass murders that I think is very different. And as you had mentioned, we did this very large study at Columbia. We just published 1,725 cases of mass murder by any means. What we found that I think is very important for the public to understand is that mental illness is rarely a motivating factor. Mental illness was a motivating factor. Severe mental illness, like involving psychosis or something like that, was present in less than 10% of those offenders. It's more common when you use something other than a gun. If you were to set the house on fire, or use a poison gas, or bludgeon people, or use a knife or something like that, be far more likely that you were dealing with some real emotional, psychological problems characterized by psychosis. And the other thing that we found, I think, is really important is that the primary motivation was people who had an extreme, intense, overwhelming emotional reaction to an event that preceded the mass shooting. They lost something, a loved one, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a husband, a wife, a job, whatever, which gets right into and discussing going postal, right? There was already a kind of a sense at the level of the crime classification manual, they already picked up on it accurately, that there seemed to be these proximal events, these stressors that preceded it. And I think that I have to say, I think we kind of put that to bed with this very large study. I think definitively we can say you have to look at individuals who have a proximal event preceding the mass murder that sets them off. The interesting thing is, and I'd love it if Ann would talk about this, is I have a hunch that that's true in serial killers too. I think that with serial killers, what you see is they can hold it together until there's this thing that's gluing them together unravels and they feel out of control, but they play it out differently. And wouldn't you say there's some truth to that in serial killers too?
Oh, absolutely. And we would do that when we studied this to find out what kinds of stressors had they, say, in the last few months or even the last year experience. And I think that goes for all types of lethal kinds of crimes. But certainly, I was just thinking out of our 36 killers, the only two I can think of that had a psychosis or had a mental illness were Richard Chase, who had a very clear delusion. Remember, he thought that he was losing blood, and so he was killing little birds and sucking the blood, and he was on a state hospital, and they got so scared of him, the staff got scared of him, that they discharged him. Of all things, they discharged him. The other one was Herbert Mullen, who had, I think, could have been as many as 11 or 12 victims, and they were all different, a mix, little children all the way up to elderly. So those were the only two, and I think that kind of fits where you said about 11% of your sample, so a small number. So there's still
under 10.
Yeah, under 10. So that I think is really important because everybody initially thinks, oh, the person is crazy. Well, crazy. Well, and for what they did, that might be appropriate, but it's certainly not mentally that they're crazy. So I've always wanted to compare the two that had a grievance, like we've talked about, a specific grievance against some issue that happened. They lost their job. They're going after the boss or whatever. And those that have an ideological
Yes.
point to make. It's a certain type of group, whatever. So that's where we're at in looking at perhaps a comparison. And I think in the three that we're looking at tonight, one of the more interesting ones from that perspective is Murdaugh, because he certainly had the robbery, greed, financial, whatever issue you want to call it. And it was domestic. He was to kill his own son as well as a wife. There are a lot of dynamics there that really haven't gone into it. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there another person that had lost their life in rather mysterious circumstances?
Yeah, they're
maid or
the housekeeper.
Housekeeper,
right.
Yeah.
Satterfield, Miss Satterfield, glorious Miss Satterfield.
And I think they're looking into that. I don't know.
Yes.
Anyway,
Which would make him a serial killer.
It definitely would. It definitely would. And just on the basis of what we know about him and what he did to his wife and his son, you certainly would. He would be a candidate certainly for that category easily.
Right. So, and this just gets into, of course, what I've come on your show before and talked about, that that we were lacking a term for it, so I started to call it elimination murder. And I think an elimination murder is a pretty nice term for it, because what it is a person who, they don't necessarily harbor ill will towards an individual, but they're simply in the way of a desired aim, like getting money or a romantic partner or something else. And so the person has to go. And so it starts to look an awful lot like the way like a mob boss might feel. It's just business. You've got to go because I need something from you, and you're in the way. And I think what you see is those divide up into much more psychopathic kind of types that will do it with great callousness and usually cover it up with a phony story and all that, or the type that's kind of wants you out of the way, and it's more impulsive, and they're not really psychopaths, but they're desperate or lonely or something like that. But you do see that a lot of those people are really killing intimates, and knowing that that's suspicious, they go out of their way to kind of fake that it was somebody that was a stranger that came in and committed it. And I always give the example of the Lizzie Borden case as an excellent example of somebody that I think clearly was guilty of killing her father and stepmother, but sort of staged it, and tried to make it look like a stranger came in and killed them, although she had every motive in the world, got rich afterwards, moved into a big mansion, and lived up the high life.
You even went to the house. Yeah. Didn't you go to the house?
I have gone to the house to investigate, and believe I am convinced that she was as guilty as hell. But I think it's interesting to to make that distinction, because this idea of being an elimination killer who might be a serial killer, it's kind of fascinating and a little bit unprecedented. You don't see too much of that unless it's somebody that's in a kind of organization where they've got to kill their enemies off, or a gang or something. But to be a family where an individual in the family is doing that is kind of intriguing. And wouldn't you say that's kind of a little unprecedented? There's a little bit of it, but
I'm thinking that there are cases where, to use your term of elimination, where to get to the real target, they have to. I'm thinking of one case which was a big corporation, and the secretary, who would be the gatekeeper, so to speak, tried to hold this person at bay, and he shot her because he had to get into the office to kill the person that he wanted. And So from that standpoint, it's important to look at the victimology. That's always to see whether the person who is the real target, if you have a multiple victim type situation. Now, certainly not in mass shooting where it's just random and going around. Certainly, but it could be. It could be that you always want to look at what's the kind of what sets things off. Even that case today down in Baltimore, there probably is something that started that, because there were I think we counted 54 casings that were found. That's a huge number. We had a case. I actually going to do this tomorrow for my students. Is a gang shooting in the emergency room, which is very scary, where they had followed the rival gang had followed these two. One that had been badly injured right into the emergency room and came in with all the staff there and kept on shooting. So, and you're really trying to analyze these cases, it becomes very important to look at motive, the triggering point. Was there an actual event that started this, and then how it plays out, and how many are peripheral or some are eliminated. I like your term there, but then they're going to be peripheral ones that just are there, that your big mall shootings and
right,
like that.
Right. I think it's also important. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, that's all right. Finish your thought. I'll get to you when you're done.
Well, I was just going to say that I think it's also important to distinguish between people who become emotionally overwhelmed and impulsively commit a mass murder incident, and the more psychopathic types or narcissistic types that scheme and then commit the shooting or mass murder later. There's a very, very big difference in personality type, because you could have a person that has a firearm in the house and learns that, let's say, a partner has been unfaithful or that they've lost their job, and they take that weapon and jump in the car and abruptly go somewhere and say, if I can't have it, you can't have it, no one cares about me, and emote, and then afterwards perhaps regret it or attempt suicide or commit suicide in a kind of act of nihilism and emotionality. But you can also have a person who says, 2 years ago, these schemers took my job, and wait until the anniversary when I show up with a weapon and kill all these people. And those people, when you look at them, that they are far more aberrant in their personality structures. And I think, and those are the people that I think sort of wind up having previous criminal histories and things like that. I can tell you that what we can say at this point is, if you were going to make a profile of a mass murderer, what it looks like to me is three things at this point. One is previous criminal history, we found to be highly significant, and that includes anything, even having a restraining order against you or something like that, or child protective services taking your child away because of violent anything. The second is drug and alcohol use is a major predictor. We found that to be, even if you're no longer using, history of drug and alcohol use, a big predictor. And the third is this proximal event that seems to precede most of the, and those are the three things you should be looking for. Not, is this a mentally ill person who can't have a weapon? If you were to do that, you would eliminate a portion of mass murder. Yeah, but not the rest.
The proximal event, would that be like a trigger event of some sort, that their life has a disruption in it?
What it is an event that makes a person feel that something in their life that has lent structure and purpose to their entire existence has now been taken from them, so that the individual doesn't understand why they're here. There's no reason to be alive anymore, because that's the be all and end all of existence for them. And then with people who have a more aberrant personality, it's more spiteful. So it's not only have I lost it, but why should you have it if I can't have it? So that what you start getting interested in these people who have personality structures that look a lot more like we see in serial killers and people who harbor long-term grudges. The most interesting people of all are these, the accused Kohberger, where they're just at that kind of dividing point where you say, which way was this person's criminal career potentially going to go? And I think we could have a very rich conversation about why we think that he's somebody that, if he is guilty, would have been at risk of going out. Because I think, Anne, one of the biggest things you'd have to agree, I hope, is that these mass murderers are not sexually motivated. There aren't those fantasy elements like that. I mean, you could find a couple like a Richard Speck or something, but you wouldn't find too many mass murderers that are going in there to kill, 5, 6, 7 people for sexual gratification.
No.
And Right.
The other interesting thing, and I don't know whether you coded for this in your sample, is we noticed is how many of our serial killers had made suicide attempts or were considered to be suicidal obviously prior to the killing, and whether that the depression or something, or that could have just been a reaction to, as you said, the proximal event, losing a job or losing a relationship or whatever.
Yeah, it's estimated that, I mean, we did look at it, and I could give you the exact number, but it's estimated that a large portion, if you look at the literature, anywhere from 30 to 50% of people, if you take our study and put it alongside other research, are using the mass murder event as a expression of suicidality. Either they wish to kill themselves afterwards, or to be killed by someone on the scene, or by a cop. So that you see it as a kind of a swan song going there.
Sure.
My camera.
Sure.
We're going out in the glades.
But the other thing,
right.
hey, we got you back.
Don't worry, I got my best side there in the. Right, I'm gonna have to.
Don't let it do you in there.
That was a good light moment.
I'm gonna go blackout for a second while I fix this, but I'm gonna be able to talk. Go ahead.
Okay, and finish your thought.
Chris, let me say, I've always said when people see a lot of people that are depressed and suicidal, et cetera, and there needs to be a real questioning at that, not just to get sympathetic to, you don't want to kill yourself, blah, 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 that kind of thing, but to really find out what's underneath the wish to kill themselves, so that we might pick up there could be some red flags there that would make us more concerned. And I don't think people do. I don't. It would be interesting if you had a panel sometime that, like people on suicide hotlines or things like that, to see if they notice anything.
Right. Well, when not to touch a third rail, Chris, but when you start getting into the whole gun debate, which I don't think we should. To me, the bigger concern is suicidal individuals that have access to firearms, because of the relationship between severe mental illness and mass shooting is overblown by the press, by the media, but when you actually research it, it just doesn't come out. It's a different kind of mental illness. It's a mental illness that has to do with personal, emotional grievances where you don't have coping skills, or your personality is brittle or inadequate to cope with events. That is very different than what people think you mean. That, the schizophrenic goes out with a gun. And there is a portion, but very unusual. And usually with those people, it's that they're not taking their meds, they're using drugs or alcohol, or that they have a very particular kind of delusion, that is like Richard Chase, who was a paranoid schizophrenic, right? Where it's just it's just business, right? I've got to eliminate this person because I need their blood. Sorry. It's like commandeering a car. I got to do it. I'm sorry. No hard feelings, that kind of thing. Or you've got to go because you're dangerous, but we don't want to think about it that way. And then when you start getting into the question of guilt and culpability, I mean, even most of those individuals are not disorganized to the point that they don't know what they're doing. It's just that they're motivated by a delusion or voices. And so that I think what people think you mean is a chaotic, disorganized killer. This actually, when Ann gets back, I think in many ways is an interesting entree into discussion of Richard Allen. But that's up to you, Chris.
Well,
where you want to go.
Before we go to him, I want to I kind of want to unwrap your feelings, from both of you about Bryan Kohberger. And one of the things I want to kind of tap into here is, with social media and the advent of, just personalities, within social media, myself included, there just seems to be this Wild West phenomena going here. And, with him, of course, he's been arrested, he's been charged, but he hasn't been put on trial. So, he's innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. However, when, the last time we had you guys here, you nailed the personality type in relationship to what ultimately we started to see in some of the things that would be unfolding with Bryan Kohberger. One of the things that I'm really curious now that you guys, the doctors, both have had a chance to see him and to read some more information. What's underneath that that personality right now? I mean, he shows up first in court, and of course, in an orange jumpsuit, and everybody goes, "Ooh, look at this evil person." And then, the lawyers get involved and they, spruce him up. And next thing you know, he's in court and he's challenging everything. Okay. But you had mentioned early on, and this was a couple of months ago, long before they arrested him, there would be things in his past, in that personality's past. Now that we know, what else are we missing from your opinions? And Gary, if it's okay, I'll start with Dr. Burgess. Okay, Ann.
Well, I want to know what there's about 2 years we know nothing about, and that's between high school and when he, I think, starts. But this is when he's supposed to be in rehab, or he's having drug problems or something. That would be very important of how he gets into that, how it goes for him. So there are 2 missing years or 3 missing years we want to know. And then he seems to find himself, if you want to call it that, and he gets into school. And look at what he takes, but he does take the criminal justice route, which is quite interesting. I have questions as to why he didn't kill the other 2 victims in that house. That he, also when he's coming down the stairs or he meets up with the one, that he leaves 2 victims. So that, I think, tells us a lot about what he had planned and what the experience was. Don't forget that, as far as we know, if it's him, this is the first time he has killed. And it's very different, at least from talking to serial killers, of what they think it's going to be like to kill somebody and what it really is like during the time. And it was a a blade type of killing, and had to have a lot of strength, and it could have been very tiring. That's something else that I think we should talk a little bit. I'd be very interested in what Gary has to do, because he encountered that victim and could have taken her out right in the doorway, I guess. So those are 2 things. And I think that you're right on in terms of I hope that whomever is going to be the expert in terms of studying him can give us some answers, because we really need that case to understand what happened to him. Because he comes from an intact family. He's got 2 sisters. There's not a lot of problematic areas, I'd say.
Dr. Brucato, what say you?
Well, a person could count on just a few hands cases of serial offenders, for example, who had rosy childhoods, who didn't come from problematic settings where at least you had one parent who was abusive or drinking or unstable or emotionally abusive or callous or something. And so, what it implies is that there must be some life events to leave this individual feeling that there was a playing field that needed leveling. And we don't know what that is. Now, I have seen some situations where a person comes from a family that was coddling you and telling you how terrific and brilliant and wonderful you were. And then you went out in the world and discovered that you were weird and that you aren't anything like they told you were. And then you are gravely disappointed and shocked that you're weird. That I've seen. And I have seen, situations where a person really only starts feeling that way when they go out in the world in adolescence and start getting rejected by people they're attracted to or things like that. But something, I think, Ann, you would agree, something had to leave this guy angry that the world didn't seem fair no matter what it is he did. I mean, he tried everything under the sun. I mean, losing weight, trying to, get position of power, trying to be the smartest guy in the room, everything. And he just was too weird. It's like an inability to accept that he put people off. And so it's all projected onto other people. And I think that what my guess is, there's something about him, for reasons that diagnostically we don't understand, that just made him so odd at baseline and with such a need for control at baseline, that he piled up a long list of people who he weirded out leaving him feeling very small and very alone and very out of control and very confused. And it may be as simple as that, because you don't really have to be treated badly. You just have to perceive that you were. And it's entirely possible he was treated fine, but he just couldn't understand why everybody rejected him all the time. So that I think when somebody gets in there and gets a full story, they're going to discover this didn't really come out of nowhere. It never does. So that we just have to figure out what it is. And I also, I really want to understand what was going on with him in terms of mental health, because just like we said in the database, we found that when you use something other than a gun, you're usually a little unwell. And there must have been something that went on there. I mean, we know he had a pretty significant mental health history. I want someone who has evaluated him properly to tell us. By his own description, he had a whole soup of mental health symptoms. These are not exonerating things, but they may help us understand the idiosyncratic world in which this guy was living, and what was up with his personality, and what were the effects of drugs and alcohol and all of that. But we're going to get a picture eventually. I mean, and what you say, a lot is going to depend on what the evaluators come up with to understand this guy. I think that's the missing piece. Yeah, that's the missing piece. So what we're left with is he looks an awful lot like a person motivated by fantasy, anger toward women in particular. And I think one of the things we foresaw that is really becoming clear is that if this guy did it, we anticipated a history of offenses that had to do with things like voyeurism and certain perversions that seemed to precede the event, so that you had somebody with this need to establish intimacies with people who didn't even know he was alive, and to kind of control everything about them. I mean, you have to imagine a situation where, like, if somebody would go out to lunch with this guy and he had been watching them, he would know things about them that were so bizarre, like the cereal they eat, and which hand they use to stir the bowl, and your couch is this color, that kind of thing. And somebody weird enough to not even hide it, to just say these weird things, to me, I think we're going to get to the bottom of what was up with him mentally, if there is anything, and what were the triggering events that kind of pushed this guy. I'm sure there was also an proximal event too.
I agree. Absolutely, yeah. I agree. And I think you'll get more information, not necessarily from him, but from people that know him, have grown up with him, certainly family members. It would be really important to do good interviews with them, especially the mother. Mothers know their kids from day one. So I always like to talk with the mother.
Yeah, and those family dynamics right now are obviously, and rightfully so, supportive of their son, that he's not involved, etc. But then you have the dynamics of the recent arrest where he had stolen his sister's cell phone while he was struggling with a drug addiction, i.e., potentially heroin. And he took a $400 drug or cell phone and sold it for $200. And I think everybody on this panel knows where that went. And so that's a small petty thing. But then you have these other situations where some of the women that have come forward, the Tinder date, the dance, right? I mean, wasn't there a dance where Gary, I think you were familiar with an incident where maybe he was rejected or something, and then his weight issues and the bullying that took place, according to some of the reports, and these haven't been verified obviously by the law enforcement in the public arena yet, but in the affidavit, his sister says, I'm going to go check the car. Could he have done it? I mean, and so do you think those family dynamics will flow into the depths of his psychology here at some point?
Well, they should. Whether it gets into court or we ever find about it, I don't know. You'd have to find that out in like conferences where there'd be a small group to do that. I don't know. What do you think, Gary?
Let's put it this way: he'd be an anomaly if it didn't turn out. It's like the old joke: our parents know how to push out buttons because they installed them. Well, I mean, usually you find out that people, the dynamics begin there, but all roads lead to home, to make a
Right.
bad pun. But I also think that it's interesting that he meets all three of the triad characteristics that we have discovered in mass murder prediction: the substance use, the previous activity, criminal activity, which would be this theft, would, believe it or not, be enough, and the proximal event that would have preceded the mass murder, which I think had to do with this losing this TA position and possibly getting in
Yes.
trouble at school, which would have probably left him incredibly out of control and been very shattering to his identity. So there again, you have this thing of a person who could hold it together if they feel they're in complete control, but then losing that, they kind of fall apart and need to reassert it. But he also has a lot of characteristics, as at that end could really touch on, that make us think about the possibility of serial offending. And so that he is right at that crossroad where he could have gone, if he's the guy who did it, he could have gone either way. I mean, and what characteristics do you feel like kind of make us wonder about serial offending?
Oh, I would say, well, just to reiterate what you have said, there's going to be something in a relationship because I think that the experience that he had as a TA out in the university, where he finally did get some power. He had power over the students. He could grade them. He could do a lot, he could comment on them. And he didn't realize that they were going to retaliate, if you will, and speak up for themselves. I mean, I think that's really quite remarkable. I can think of some students that would be, devastated by that. But that could have been a surprise that he doesn't. I think you brought this point up that he doesn't really see the world as it really is and what people are doing, and that he gets very angry is what happens. He gets very angry at that. So I just hope that we get enough information that we can talk with people that have examined him. I don't think prosecution is necessarily going to get at it, but certainly defense will. And when do they have to let us know who are the experts for that? Do you know, Chris?
I'm dying to know.
I do not know. No, I do
Yeah.
not. I know they're just assembling that team now to kind of go that direction. But I don't think he has completely been diagnosed or evaluated by the court yet. I don't know if that's been
Yeah.
ordered yet, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen it personally. But I am curious. You had both mentioned a while ago, and now that we know through the channels where Gary, you were on Dateline and et cetera, where the channels of him purchasing the knife through Amazon, and then that you had made a comment earlier about the personalization of that knife, and we know it's symbolic in nature of phallics, et cetera, from many cases, and you've done thousands of situations where knives have been utilized, but you made a comment about the gloves, and I don't know if anybody caught it, of whether or not, and I'm not going to ruin your thunder here, but do you remember what you had mentioned? The two of you had been talking about the gloves during the commission of the crime.
Oh, yes. And do you want to get to it, or do you want? Because I
I,
think
I
I know
was
what this is
I was
talking
going
about.
to say something else. I think it's interesting. I'll let you do the gloves, but I'm interested that the only DNA, as far as we know from reports, was on the clip of the sheath. So he could have had gloves on at a certain point and then taken them off just to get one, whatever the DNA is or the fingerprint or whatever it is on the piece of blood on this sheath. So that it's not on all of it. Now, maybe that's not true because we have to wait for the lab reports. But that seems to be the one thing that's going to that he didn't realize that he could be caught that way. The only other thing really is the car, right? That's the only other tangible evidence. But on the glove, Gary, you want to do the glove or?
Well, it's complicated because theoretically, as Greg Cooper reminded us, I remember when we were discussing it, that DNA could have gotten on that clasp well before he was even in that house. But what I found really interesting was the possibility that this obsessional, glove-wearing, anxious guy might have removed those gloves at the time of the killing in order to feel it more completely, to feel more powerful or immune from getting, we have certainly seen that, Anne, in our work. We've looked at, we're looking at that and in asphyxiation, things like that. And I also thought it was kind of interesting because, part of me wondered, I don't know where the sheath would have been on him, but I wondered if the sheath came off because of his belt, if he had been unbuckling it or engaging in any sexual activity, and if that's related to DNA that got on the sheath. But without getting into, gruesome detail, part of me wondered if in the frenzy of that moment it came off a belt, and if he was barehanded. And the reason I think this is important is because we've talked about how we don't think that there was at least an overt sexual component to this case. But I think, and you would agree, that if we're dealing with somebody that is more of the potential for serial killing variety, more often than not, there is a sexual quality, even if it isn't overt. And we start to think of that even with the voyeurism and all of this, they're all women, that he seems to be interested in and all of that. And I wonder if you agree that it wouldn't be terribly shocking if there was a sexual component to this.
Oh, I think there was a sexual component. I don't think I really do, because of the length of time, what he did. Would he watch any of the activity? Was there anything going on? And then that he doesn't do anything to the two women in the floor tells us something. That whatever, I think that there was the sheath, if I remember correctly, was underneath the one
of the bodies.
One of the bodies was underneath.
Well, it's been reported both ways, that it was laying next to her and that it was kind of underneath her. So, one of the things that are that's definitely been confirmed is it's his DNA on that snap, on that sheath, whether it's touch DNA or, saliva or whatever. Of course, that's going to be for the scientists to all, fight. Right. I mean, the defense has got to take that on. And of course, social media has taken it on, by saying stuff. Why do you talk about things that aren't even confirmed facts? I mean, well, it's a confirmed fact that that's his DNA in that room. Now, how it got there is going to be the debate, right? I mean, that's why the justice system is the way it is, but it is definitely his. And so, I don't know if you saw the numbers, but it was, astronomical. You basically have to go to another planet to find the donor. And we had the same challenge as you guys remember during the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, nobody debated that it wasn't O.J.'s DNA. They debated the glove, if it fit. And, touche to Johnny Cochran and, F. Lee Bailey and, Barry Scheck and all the team, the dream team that, convinced a jury of 12 that, if it doesn't fit, you must, not convict, let them go. But in this case, we've got this gentleman from Pennsylvania who all of a sudden his DNA shows up in that house underneath one of these poor victims. And which leads me to another thought process here, because Gary, you'd mentioned it a moment ago, and Anne, you kind of dovetailed into it. This was personal potentially for him. But why do you think, I know you both feel that there is definitely, a sexual undertone here, but why do you think that? What is it about the brutality of the incident? What is it that brings it to that surface, in your opinion?
Well, and is one of the great contributors to the insight in violent crime that there can be these undertones. So I think we would be remiss in not giving the spotlight to Anne here.
Well, I think all that has come out about his surveillance of her and the development of the fantasy that this went on, and it took a long time, at least it seems like a long time to develop and to plan it. And they get a lot out of that time of planning. So we have that as an important factor, and we're getting evidence if it's him from the social media. And there probably is a lot more that's going to come out. Whether he was at that house multiple times, we don't know, because it was a place where young people went. And so I think that sets the groundwork for why he did it. And we didn't know that, remember, initially, that we just knew that these 4 young people were horribly murdered. And then as the pieces began to come in, I think that tells us more. And the more we get about it, I think we're going to not be that surprised when we hear more and more of his background or what he did. I still want to know was how he did it in the dark. Remember, it was so, whether anybody could have seen light. Did he have a light on a hat or something like that so that he could watch? Or was he in there just, I've seen cases, and even some of our serial killers, where they spend a lot of time just in the room, if you will, before they kill.
Yeah, and I'm curious, with his technological skills, if there is some, technology involved here, like filming or, photographs, etc. I'm curious if that's not sitting somewhere,
Did they ever find a cell phone or an iPhone?
Well, they turned over, 51 terabytes of data to the authority. The authorities gave the defense 51 terabytes of data. But Dr. Brucato, what were you gonna say?
Well, I think that one thing that I think smacks of a sexual undertone is at least if we start putting a timeline together, this quality of needing to do a little bit more to get a thrill. It feels like a kind of getting some kind of a boost or arousal from things like, first perhaps stalking, and then, perhaps he was responsible, we don't know, for that incident of breaking into a car and moving the panties, possibly being the person that helped set up cameras in a young woman's house. And what would be the reason for doing that other than to spy on the individual and probably masturbate while you're watching them, right? And feel that godlike power over them. So that you see this kind of stepwise process that is so typical of individuals that move their way into a violent crime. And, but for me, based on previous people that I've dealt with and some of the kind of stuff that we're glimpsing in this case, I have to say, if I were hard pressed to speculate about an underlying motive, I think that one of the major things we want to think about is that this guy had a very, very high need for predictability. I think it bothered him that people could not be reduced to a science. Stalking is a way of reducing people to a science and always knowing where they are predictably as objects in your life. But I also think that it was a way of studying them, like they were under a microscope or something. And I think that for this guy who was socially awkward, the idea was, if I could just get people down to a science and study them, maybe I could get them to kind of like me, or I could control them in some way. Or maybe if I dictate to them, this is the right way you do it, I'm the smart one, you're the fool. And we certainly saw that when he was pulled over, for example, where he managed to convince the officer that he knew better than she did. And then suddenly she's apologizing to him practically, so it's this way of spinning the narrative that I'm the smart one and you're, and some proximal event must have felt to him like a last straw. Like, I thought I had it all here in my grips and I lost anyway. Even now, even doing this, I can't have control over these people. They still can't be predicted. They still don't think I'm powerful. And then you wind up with a person saying, that's it. It's D-Day. It's time to go in and like play out this thing once and for all. And in doing that, if he did kill these victims, as I always say, he bound them together forever. In his mind, they and he are one, right? You look up one, you see the name of the other, And I think that's why we see a lot of serial killers doing things like visiting graves and keeping trophies and all that. It's a way of having a predictable thing in your life, predictable object in your life, and people who didn't have predictability socially or in their family life, and Fenders talk about this, so that I wouldn't be shocked at all if it had something to do with that. And wouldn't you say it seems
Yeah,
to have something to do with that, reducing people to a science, and
yeah, I certainly would
what do you
agree with that. The other thing I'd like to know, I'd love to see some of his papers that he wrote for his
oh yeah,
graduate. I mean,
right.
who he talked about and how he did. I'd love to see some of those papers, and I'm sure they will. Those would all be important information for the examiners to get hold of.
And how he tolerated any time he didn't get an A.
Oh, right.
Can
Yes,
you imagine
right.
how he would argue with I could just picture it, the way he would litigate and argue and berate until they said, okay, fine, you're right. I mean, I wish that we would start to get that kind of picture of him from
Yeah.
the people that interacted with him, and it would pile up rapidly. That this was a guy that was probably so hot-headed and,
Yeah.
and awkward that you just let him win because you didn't want to deal with it.
But he thought and he did get away with it. He thought he could get away with it. The things that he was saying, I'd like to know. Remember, the things that he was saying to the professors. I haven't heard what it was, but you just hear that he was making remarks about them, and I thought that's really, that he wasn't picked. Well, he was picked up for that. So.
Well, and when he was the TA, obviously, he was really grading his underlings pretty harshly. But then after the homicide, they started reporting, the guy, he was, just giving us A's. I mean, one of the kids anyway, started saying that. But okay, so let's do this. So let's have a shift for a second to Delphi and Mr. Allen. I know there's. And by the way, everybody, so we've got 2,300 people in here right now watching. But I have starred 19, separate questions and stuff, good ones that will be thrown at the docs here in a couple of minutes. But I want to get through, so I haven't forgotten about you. Please forgive me for not putting them all up yet, but they're there and I see them and we appreciate it. So, okay. Gary, I know you have a lot of thought process here, and Ann, I know you're going to dovetail right into it. But what say you on the Delphi murders, and how do you differentiate from Kohberger to that?
Right. There are two conversations you could mean, Chris. You could mean a conversation about the profile of the type of person who committed Delphi. Or you could mean a conversation about the suspect that the entire media seems to believe
I would never argue
is the
with you
be
if
all
you
and
were
end
my,
all of Delphi. Right.
Either one
Well,
of you.
I will just say very quickly that the overlap between psychotic illness and violence has been the heart of my entire career, and I have to tell you that what I am very concerned about with regard to Richard Allen as a suspect, is that we have to hold judgment because we're dealing with one of two scenarios. We don't have the information yet to distinguish which of these we're dealing with. One possibility is that we're dealing with a malingerer, a very psychopathic malingerer that is pretending to be deeply mentally ill, with the defense kind of going along with the narrative that he's schizophrenic and delusional, and he's eating paper and doing all these bizarre things just after confessing to his wife and mother. But then we have the problem of him not having a history that strongly corroborates being a psychopath. And then on the other hand, we have the issue that he could very well have made these repeat confessions in the context of being mentally ill. And we need an evaluation to determine if we're dealing with a person who is suggestible and disturbed and is not cannot actually be placed there. I mean, we can have arguments about this bullet evidence, which I must say I strongly suspect is going to fall out. And then what are we left with? So that I think we have to hold judgment. I'm agnostic and open to anything, But I know there was an evaluation where people went in, 3 professionals, went in to see about if he was in the proper holding setting and if he needed, about his med situation. But that is quite different than evaluating if this guy could be confessing in the context of being psychotic. And I think when you have a person eating paper and breaking their tablet and looking catatonic, it is an important thing to think about. Now, but I am agnostic to which way. Now, my problem with this is, and this is where I think Ann and I could really get into this, is that crime scene, that situation at Delphi, does not look like the handiwork of a person with psychosis or psychotic disorder. It looks like the handiwork of a pretty organized offender. Wouldn't you say, Ann?
I would say that, yes. We don't have a lot of information on it, of course, right?
I'll tell you what I know, and we
Usually,
can reason it out.
oh, okay. Because I'm wondering if a blade was used. I know that there was a gun
Yes,
involved, but I would
yes,
suspect
there was
a
a blade.
Yeah,
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 yeah. I mean, what I think, Ann, is that there are whiffs of disorganization in whoever probably did this, because it does look like somebody attacking close to home, right? And which you can see obviously in a more disorganized offender. But there are things that we know, like, for example, the staging of the crime scene afterward, after moving the bodies, that smacks of a more psychopathic, scheming personality, not a disturbed person.
yeah, yeah.
The another example of this being the idea that there was a sexual component to it, and that they appear to have been moved slightly to somewhere else, not right in the middle of the bridge in front of everybody, like a psychotic person would do, according to your own work. And so
Yes.
that it seems to me that what we see is there was a little bit of whiff of disorganization. My strong hunch is that it was something like alcohol or something like that that could have added to it. My feeling about Delphi, if you want me to lay it out, Chris, I'll tell you my thinking about it. Would that be okay?
No,
And I want
I
Ann's
don't want
thoughts on this very much. Yeah, you think? Well, first of all, Ann, we know from the video, this is an older person. This is not a 20-something-year-old where we think this might be the person's first offense, right?
Right.
So the first thing that bothers me is, where is the criminal history that is consistent with somebody where this wouldn't be their first rodeo? I think, Ann, you'd agree, 2 victims at once for a first time offense when a person is older would be pretty unprecedented, wouldn't you say?
I would say so. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
was, yeah. Go ahead.
that's very strange to me, and I'm also very deeply suspicious of, if you did have an older person who committed this offense, they probably would have a history consistent with at least violence towards women, and certainly some perverse sexual actions, things like that, some diversity of criminal action in their history, signs of psychopathy. But I also think that there would have been a proximal event that would have set this person off. Like, and I think I've always said, I think the fact that they were found on Valentine's Day is highly suspicious. It feels to me like somebody that was furious at women, and somebody hurt him. And the point was, I'm going to find the first woman that walks, first girl, any female that walks into this spider web, and I'm going to act out. And I think the idea that they were children, that they were, preteens, I think is kind of irrelevant. I don't see this as a child molester or something like that. I think he just took any female that walked into the web, sort of like when Bundy killed the 13-year-old, and because he was at that point hungry, and just took whoever he can, like when he killed the Kimberly Leach at the end. So that I don't necessarily think that this is somebody who would have a history of child sexual offenses, because people who commit child sexual offenses tend to be cognitively a little more impaired, or to be a little bit more on the disorganized odd side, or to be more weird interpersonally, and so forth. There are psychopathic people who commit child offenses, but this, and the other thing is, Ann, I could tell you, you could pretty much figure out from even before the documents just got released, that they were killed with a blade. It looks like their throats were slashed. They were buried. They had wrapping around the neck at the wake service, and the panties were missing, and socks, one sock from a victim. And there's some speculation about trophies. I think maybe this is a person who got rid of them because maybe some semen or some DNA got on them. But I wonder what your thoughts are, about the picture of somebody that suddenly, at an older age, would decide to do something like this, right, in this kind of organized way, and then the person in prison is a person that's exhibiting psychotic-like behavior, and no one has assessed if he's psychotic. I mean, it's very confusing. So I wonder, I'll just sort of give you the floor at this point.
Sure, yeah. Well, from the victimology standpoint, you've got 2 young adolescent girls. And that's highly unusual. I agree with you to it's got to be somebody that either had planned it or knew them. He also, I would say it's a male, and that he knew the area, he knew the location, he knew where to do. So it's got to be somebody very familiar. And as I learned from the agents, it's just take a 1-mile radius and you'll find your suspect. So from that standpoint, how he gets both of them down had to been a lure, a trick, whether it was the gun, could have been the gun, but as I understand it, they were on the bridge and he gets them down, or does he get them down afterwards? So that's pretty, he had to really scare them to get them down, where he then goes ahead and whoever he kills them. I do think it has a sexual motive, and that this was planned and he probably watched them. Do we know if they had been there before? That kind of thing. And then when you look at when I looked at the persons who lived there or lived in that area, that's the one that it sounded like was the one. And then I was so surprised to see Richard Allen, because he was the most unlikely person. He was married, he had kids, he worked. He certainly had no history, right?
Great minds think alike, and I'm also very compelled by the owner of that property, Ron Logan, who's dead. And incidentally, in case the audience doesn't realize it, Ron Logan cooked up a sham story about where he was at the time of the murders that collapsed rapidly, and recruited a cousin to tell a BS story that he was at an aquarium shop when the murders happened, and had a background that included things like beating a female partner with a wrench in the face and dragging a woman by the hair and strange sexual perversions and things like that. And I think you don't see that stuff in the background of Allen. Now, all I'm saying is I'm agnostic about who did this, but I think until we know if Allen is some kind of master malingerer, or if he actually has a psychotic disorder that even predates this, I am deeply concerned that what you might be, and I also want the IQ of Allen, because people who have borderline or lower IQ can say yes to anything. You can say, "Did you commit this murder?" "Yes, I did." And so that I think we don't know how suggestible he is. The other thing is, how does it make sense that a person would get on a phone call and tell someone repeatedly, a wife, a mother, a wife and his mother, that you committed a crime, and then take steps to hide it through malingering? A recorded phone call, that's pretty disorganized behavior.
Right.
And I guess the only argument I could see somebody making, if it doesn't turn out that he's just a master psychopath and that explains it, is until I see evidence that he was actually there, I just think we've got to be agnostic. And I don't like the rapid conclusion the press made that, he confessed, done deal. I think that's a little, we should be careful.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead, Doc.
I was going to say you have to work some false confessions to really understand this. I've done about half a dozen where they have confessed to it, and it wasn't them. But we have to get the actual evidence. Is there any DNA? So that you can absolutely rule them out. That's the other thing, or rule them in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So incidentally, go ahead, Chris.
No, so there's a couple other dynamics, right? I think that we need to add into this discussion. One of them, obviously, is the other individuals, who put up the fake, catfish, come 14-year-old, but he's really, a pedophile. And then is there a correlation between the three, the owner of the property, that RL gentleman, who's deceased, right? I mean, he's deceased right now. And then Alan and the third. Is this something that you could see, for the sake of discussion here, that they're luring the girls there in hopes of capturing, maybe a slave situation here where, they've got two young, teenagers, and, all three of them are in this together. Do you see any thought process as that being a possibility?
Well, that's very interesting.
I'm not impressed by that. I think that the person who committed Delphi was a sexually perverse, hostile, paranoid loner with probably a long pattern of committing all kinds of offenses and lousy, unstable relationships with women, and probably a drinker. These are the things I would predict. But I do not see this as a guy who was sophisticated on the internet and luring children for sexual offenses. I mean, and if they were experts at that, this was some kind of a half-assed version of doing it. I mean, it wasn't exactly sophisticated. I mean, he walked them 0.2 miles off the road, it looks like, and did whatever he did with them. It looks like a pretty inadequate person who probably didn't actually complete a sexual act. I would be very hard pressed to believe that happened.
Yeah, no,
And it
I'm not saying
culminates
that
in them
Alan
eliminating
did.
them and then moving them and staging them. Yeah.
I'm saying it was kind of, like a domino effect that one, hooks them on the line, and then, knows that they're going to be down there. And Alan just happens to be, the guy on the bridge, hypothetically, and that the other gentleman is, because he had a specific order, get down the hill.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so he had a destination in his mind, you would think, based on what he said. And so that would put into play the property, and it would put into play, your thought process on RL, and that the third guy who got him there is just kind of, just a piece of the puzzle to get him there. Not as he's sophisticated to work that, that Snapchat and all that other stuff that lured him
Right.
potentially down there, right?
That's an interesting hypothesis. I mean, I personally think that it would be very strange if this guy, let's say you're talking about Logan, or let's say you're talking about Al. I mean, where is the history that would be consistent with years and years of offenses against children that you would expect to see in people who are involved in that, even from electronic data? Where is the evidence of that? That's what's so weird about it. What I surmise, as this is a person who had a previous history and was held in check by being able to be in some kind of meaningful relationship, lost that relationship and became furious. And I think that's why the Valentine's Day thing is so suspicious to me. I mean, the idea that they were moved and staged and discovered on Valentine's Day feels very powerful to me as a way of saying, I'm a bitter, nasty person who's been rejected. And I went out and I found some females to take this out on, and they're all interchangeable in my mind. This is who walked on the bridge, and that's my feeling about it. I mean, and I don't know what your sense is about if the Valentine's Day discovery is a coincidence, but it's very interesting as a symbolic date involving loneliness and bitterness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the date is important. Do you think they had a setup or whomever, you're saying it's one, possibly two, possibly whatever, underneath that bridge, that they had a little place where they were actually acted out some things before the killing?
My understanding of the facts based on the affidavits and the information that's available to the public in relationship to, he had a gun,
Right.
and he had a knife. So he comes to this event with, both possibilities of, do I make it personal with the knife, or, do I now have a control here with the gun? We have it appears, based on some of the lab reports, that the gun was racked and, a bullet was ejected, and they matched it, according to the lab reports, to the ejection port of Allen's 40 caliber handgun. Now, to me, I don't see Allen luring them down there. I agree with you. and I'm going to redeem myself here, Doc Brucato, just for a second. I don't see him personally coming down, with this huge idea of, okay, I'm going to get them down there and, blah, blah, blah. But I do find it interesting that he is in the area that day, and that this other guy in the other town over, this Klein guy, was pretty good and sophisticated of luring, and playing this role of this, supermodel kid on, this deception, this secret life that he's projecting in social media. And that I wonder if all three of them knew each other and they hatched the scheme of, okay, I'll get them there. Okay, I'll control them. And then the third, okay, well, we'll use my, my house, for lack of a better term, and my property. I think the dynamics of all three personalities is really, really fascinating because, obviously when they get down there, it appears there's some staging. It appears that, the one of the young ladies' underwear was taken and a sock was taken. And it appears one of them broke away while the other one, didn't. And I'm assuming it's the younger one who probably submitted pretty quickly out of just pure terror. And being respectful to their parents, I don't want to, go too far into that, right? But I just think it's just really interesting that they get this one guy.
Yeah.
And to your point, Dr. Brucato and Dr. Burgess, that, now he's eating his papers and, he's kind of wackadoodle, at least he's projecting that right now. But are you tracking where I'm going there? Am I making any?
Yeah, it's. I guess what it sounds like you're saying to me is that because there's this important question of the mental status of this offender, the first issue is let's find out first if this guy is telling the truth when he confesses. Number one, actually figure out if this is real, or if he's a master malingerer and a psychopath. Although, as I keep saying, nothing in his history suggests that, which is sort of strange, right? I also want to know, did he have a mental health history before Delphi, right? Then you take that piece of information and you look at the crime scene, and it just doesn't match a person with that kind of condition at all. It looks like a garden variety, kind of sexually perverse offender who lures people somewhere, plays out some perverse fantasies, kills them just to kind of get rid of them, stages it, covers up evidence. And then on top of that, you're left with this conundrum of why it at least circumstantially looks like Alan is sort of there and around. And I guess what you're saying is maybe, it's like, like Sherlock Holmes used to say, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth, which would lead us to conclude that there was some nexus of people potentially. But I am inclined to think that this was a solo act, and that what you may have here is a situation, I hate to say it, I think, John Douglas said when he went in and looked at this, many things similar to, the way that Ann and I are thinking about this, about the person knowing the area and the kind of offender. And what he said was, after a year, this case, like, you wouldn't be surprised if it went cold. Like, it was like too late to do the kinds of interventions that would have been necessary to pretty rapidly flush out some local person who probably was involved. And now you're left kind of retroactively trying to patch it together. And it's really hard. I mean, Anne, wouldn't you think that the FBI would have probably said from the get-go, like, let's do this quickly before this guy gets wise and covers things up and gets out of town?
Right. They would have done the interviews. They would have gotten the interviews and really nailed them down and set it up. I can see Douglas setting it up and bringing points in that to make him unnerved. Oh, absolutely. It's like one of the ones, if you look at some of the cases that we did, it's exactly what they would have done.
Yeah, and to clarify this comment here, what I'm saying is, it wasn't a full on, foot chase. I'm just saying both bodies are separate from each other, and it's more of my experience of working 300 murders when I make a comment like that. It's not that it's a full on chase But I appreciate it. So I thank you for your comment, though. And so anyway, it sounds like you are making some really interesting comments here because he's eating his papers. He's been evaluated now. There's a court date set. It's going to be interesting to see how this one unfolds for sure. Is there anything else you guys want to cover before I get into the questions real fast for our audience?
Well, I think it would be really important and to talk about what we mean by staging. And Chris, I mean, you've certainly had experience with this too, and it comes up in the Murdaugh case. But I think we have to talk about that in order for people to understand why it's hard to believe that this is a psychiatrically disturbed, disorganized person, because I think we have to just for a moment talk about the notion of moving them back to that place and setting it up to look like something that it wasn't. I mean, Anne, wouldn't you say that's a big giveaway of an organized offender?
Absolutely, that's organized. Disorganized, just they do what they do to the body and just leave the body. It's rare that they would go moving it around or carry it around or staging. Staging is much more an organized characteristic.
Right. And what do you think, Anne, about because I have said previously that even though it sounds like it would make a lot of sense, I don't know. I could not name offenders, even when I went into my records, that kept panties and a sock as their trophy. I've heard about people taking underwear and things from people that they're stalking or breaking in the house, but taking them off a victim and keeping those, believe it or not, I can't name a case. And I wonder, because more commonly they take a piece of jewelry or an ID card or something like that, but to actually remove the underwear and keep it, I could see destroying them because of evidence or DNA or something, but to actually take it can you think of a case where
as a fetish item? Sure, yeah, I do.
Off of a victim where they would keep the panties from the person that was killed?
Sure.
Oh,
if
yeah.
they rape them.
I haven't seen it.
We don't know anything about. I don't think I haven't seen anything about their bodies or any of the.
Right.
So we want to be careful that we don't go down other roads. But I don't think that would be unusual for them to take off. In fact, that's often one of the favored souvenirs they can have. I remember that
from a victim you've killed, Anne?
Yeah, the one I remember, that Canadian pilot that
oh God,
remember him? He even wore some of the panties, and when they looked at they found all kinds of underwear, and one of the victims, even who had survived, was able to identify hers. So.
Right, because I've certainly heard it with living people, like where you take it out of their drawer or something.
Yeah,
but I went into my records and I couldn't really find a situation, and you'd know better than I but I couldn't find a situation where somebody killed a victim and then took the panties off and kept them. And it's a little subtle point, but again, as Sherlock said, there's nothing more important than trifles. These little details somehow matter, and I wonder about that. But I find that to be really interesting, because to me, this looks like somebody that just was tidying up, getting rid of everything. I mean, I picture like a bunch of stuff piled up in a bag and tossed into a dump or a compost heap or a fire or something, because and the other thing is, where are the cameras that would have been on this guy's property? I mean, he was notoriously paranoid and didn't like people coming on his property. Where are the cameras? I mean, is this guy really not have a camera anywhere on that giant property? It's weird to me. But anyway, yeah, that's odd.
Yeah.
I just, it doesn't match anything about. But anyway,
so this one, as we get closer to it, is going to be multiple episodes. Where I want to get Greg back in here and just just kind of just do what we do here and just. Think tank kind of concept here. Okay, so I have a bunch of questions, 24 to be exact. So put your seatbelts on, and guys and gals, if I know if I've missed your question, please forgive me. up front. It's not intentional. And for the sake of time, I think these 24 are going to be a lot. So the first one is from Love the Interview. What do you think the suspect did with the knife? And this is in relationship to Kohberger.
Kohberger.
What do you
Right.
guys think?
What do you
Well,
think,
we
Ann?
all want to know. We all want to know. We think he has it. That it was whatever it means to him. If it was a special knife or he just bought it as any knife. But he knows that that's needed. He would have known that that was very much needed to prove whatever, so that he's either got it himself or he has so hidden it that it will never be found, like, in the middle of the ocean or something like that. It's somewhere. Gary,
Okay.
what do you think?
Yeah, I think he has a personal relationship with it. Greg has even talked about that he probably spent time with it and became familiar with it, and you have to bond with it. It reminds me of that scene in Sweeney Todd when he gets his razor blades back and he says, "At last, my arm is complete again." It's like that feeling of this is mine. This is my. Remember, even in Sweeney Todd, he calls his blade his friend.
Yeah, this
Right.
would be
You have a relationship with it, and I think it's sort of, I hate to say it, it's reminiscent of the way men talk about their phallus. It's the idea that you give it it has its own personality because it's you, it's an extension of you. And that is not a trophy that somebody would get rid of. It's like somebody who got married throwing away their wedding ring. That's the relic from the day that he feels that he became what he always wanted to be. He wouldn't get rid of that thing unless he was just destroying evidence, but I find it very hard to believe.
that would be an item that if one of the behavioral science profilers, we could ask Greg this, would have used, had it just laying in a strategic place on the desk or wherever they're interviewing him, and just leaving it there right where he could see it at a certain, whoever they're interviewing,
Yeah.
certainly Kohberger. That would be a
Now,
perfect.
and this question's directed at you, but
Great
Gary
point.
weigh in. Dr. Burgess, what was Bryan Kohberger's alleged motivation in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, it's going to be a personal cause out of the four that we have already gone through. And you can have multiple motives, and some are more primary than others. So I would say it's a personal cause that had been fed by a particular grievance about something, whether it was a failed relationship, a wanted relationship, and that there was a sexual motive to it. It would all tie in that way. That's what I believe.
Okay. Out of the various types of offenders from the classifications manuals and Gary, on your work, which type are the most common?
Well, the motives in
Mass
classification is going to be personal cause, and there are about 12 of them, and it can be jealousy, revenge, anger. It can be emotional, or it can be specific, but certainly would fall into that. But as I said, it also has a sexual component, so it would be a secondary kind of a motive.
In mass murder, we found that the most common motivation was emotional upset about a proximal event that activates the individual who doesn't have the coping skills to kind of cope, to deal with it, and becomes overwhelmed. And regarding serial killing, there are different types. The most common is the serial sexual homicide. The vast majority of serial killers are motivated by some form of sexual gratification, or at least abnormal psychological gratification that has undertones of sex to it. But that does seem to be the favored outlet for people that are trying to get even with people that they feel have hurt them over their lifespan. And I think we would be remiss in not saying that in mass shootings, mass murders of all sorts, serial killing is very male. I mean, maleness is very important. I mean, a person is 8 times more likely to commit a violent crime if they're male. I mean, testosterone clearly plays a role in this. We could also talk about, if you're going to talk about the commonness, distinctions between the sexes that are interesting. I mean, as a simple example, when females, biological females, commit serial killing, it's more likely that they knew the victims. They were intimates. Whereas with male offenders, they go out and they stalk and they hunt and they find people that are more emblematic of the people that have hurt them, that they could take things out on. The weapons are different. Females are more likely to use things like poisons and things that are where you don't have to actually go up to the victim and pin them down and attack them with a blade or something like that. And so that I think, and when there is a sexual motivation, which is almost never, like in the case of Eileen Wuornos, who was a great rarity, right, or people like that. They're almost always people who had been abused, horrendously abused by males, and it's a kind of a revenge fantasy that plays out. Whereas with the males, it isn't necessarily that kind of thing. It could just be feeling slighted or having your ego wounded by pretty much anything. So, and the other thing, when you talk about the commonness, is again, that you want to think about when you hear about mental illness, severe mental illness, even though the media and movies and so forth have made a link, you want to think in the opposite direction of the kind of person who would go out and commit violent crime. You want to think about a person far more likely to be a victim of violent crime or to be misunderstood, pilloried by the local community as the person who did it, when some psychopath is getting away with it, that kind of thing. So that when they do commit it, it's of a very specific nature. And that's where Anne's work and looking at the disorganized quality is so important. Because when people like that commit offenses, you can tell that there's this organization of the mind playing out in the offense. And anything that I missed there in terms of...
Oh, that's good. Very good.
What do you think about the gender differences, the sex differences between offenders?
I think, well, first of all, there are very few females that would have a sexual motive that I can think of. Most of the
Right.
motives are going to be, as you said, very personal. And I don't know how you would classify. Certainly, the women. We just finished a study where under 5, it's going to be a female. It's going to be a caregiver that kills the child under 5. Then you move into the older.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah,
that's interesting data.
Yeah.
Okay, so at the conclusion of their crimes, this for both of you, do they often feel justified?
Yes, that's why they can do it. Yeah, they're especially if it's a revenge or like going postal, things like that. They don't regret what they did. They felt that was they had to do it. That's the curious thing about it. I don't know whether you can comment on that, Gary.
Well, there is a reporter, a podcaster, and a reporter I know. I won't give his name because I haven't gotten permission to do it, but he privately communicates with a lot of mass shooters in prison. And what he shared with me that I found really, really fascinating is that everyone that he wrote to told him that they regretted the mass shooting, that they had come to regret it. But the serial killers don't, unless they have some kind of religious conversion or something where they say they're a different person, like a born again or something. But it seems to me that because mass shooting is so much, or mass murder is so much more impulsive and a reaction to a proximal event, that it doesn't surprise me that after the person is covered in blood or has been arrested or whatever, that it has that quality of looking back and saying, what was I thinking? Now, of course, I'm speaking about mass murderers of the type that are impulsive, not the scheming psychopathic kind who I doubt regrets it. But I think you'd be very hard pressed to find a serial killer that would say, looking back, I wish I hadn't done that. I think of them more as people that would put their arms behind their head, lay back in the jail cell and remember it like it was, a fabulous fantasy that they had of the past. And the other thing is these people, especially the males that commit serial sexual homicide, I think it has to do with testosterone, are extraordinarily visual people. And they can picture these things like Samuel Little that could draw the victims right down to their jewelry and the way their hair was years later. I mean, it's like they took a Polaroid in their head of the thing. And it's very difficult for us to understand that in the way that they can plot and scheme and picture the scene and where everybody is going to go. It's like being a very good chess player. I found in looking at some of these mass murderers when I was examining the cases that a lot of them picked the location because they knew the whole blueprint of where they were going to run and fire and where people would be able to escape and where the guards were located and where the windows were and and you have to imagine people that are going in. Like, for example, Adam Lanza, who was, clearly a disturbed young man who kind of flies in the face of this notion of them not being mentally ill, right? He was one of these exceptions. But Adam Lanza, whose goal was to rack up the highest body count, because being somebody obsessed with certain types of video games, he carried it over into believing that he wanted to be the mass shooter with the highest body count. And that if somebody killed him during the act, they would take his points, right? So that you had this idea, he was keeping a score sheet of mass murders in the house and all that. And so he had, you have to understand, plotting to go into a place where you want to maximize on the victims and saying, if I go into this room, there are this many people in that room, and then I could blockade them over there, and I could, so that it's like a general going into a war or something. I mean, it's intense visual quality. And I think, Anne, doesn't it remind you of a hunter?
Well, it certainly reminds me of Hunter, but it also reminds me of these video games. And I'm wondering how many, whether we're getting into that's what they have to do, is to figure out who's gonna and where they can hide and so forth. I just wonder how much these video games are giving some of these.
I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say. I think, let me put it this way: the evidence is not conclusive one way or the other. But I think it may reduce inhibition or give person a sense of fantasy that already has those kind of ideas. But I don't know if it would instill in a person, go out and. But I think anything that kind of, because remember, your brain doesn't know the difference between really doing something and it doesn't know the difference between pornography and actually being sexually with someone. And that, you could watch, Chris, we did that whole episode on the metaverse that gets into that issue, if anybody ever wants to go back and watch that. But yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up about the commonness of these.
So the next, just that dovetails actually into Penny's thought. What gives us substance that they lack? Meaning, why is everybody so curious about this? I mean, not only just true crime, but boy, just the blood and guts and just getting into our own psyche. How does that play into why we watch this stuff? And with social media, it's just, you now have folks that are writing letters to Murdaugh. You got folks writing letters to Bryan, and everybody's cheering for Bryan and cheering for Alec, etc. I mean, I'm sure Alan's going to have his own fan club pretty soon here. But what is it about that psychiatrist piece of this?
Well, Anne, you want to touch on the why we're all fascinated with true crime?
Yeah, right. Well, there is the challenge. Much of it is the challenge. It's something that a lot of people can't understand why people do it. They say that's a awful worst thing I've ever heard. So that they are curious to know what it is that motivates people to commit such. That's one part, and the other is it's kind of like when pilots get together, they talk about crashes and avoiding crashes. It's what do you do to avoid things? I know that I hear students talk about, what if they're in the mall and somebody comes out with a gun? What are they supposed to do? Because it's so it becomes how close can you come to being a victim yourself in some of these mass shootings? I think that's much more captivating than the serial killing. That this idea that you're not where you're safe, and how do you protect yourself? That's part of it.
Right. Well, if you look at the statistics on who is most interested in violent crime, it turns out that most of the viewers, for example, of television programs about true crime and the readers of books on the subject are female. And I think that's very interesting because females are also disproportionately victimized by violent crime over males. I think what that suggests is that it has something to do with an evolutionary process of saying, let me be a step ahead of these people who may victimize me. I want to understand them. I also think that there is a incredible vulnerability that we can identify with in the victims of some of these crimes, particularly like, for example, the Kohberger case. I mean, people in their bed. I mean, at night. I mean, the notion that somebody could just come in while you're asleep and attack you, like, or if they were asleep, attack you like that. And but the other piece of it is you're talking, Chris, is about hybristophilia, right? Hybristophilia being this arousal by people that have committed violent crime. I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm kind of working on an article about this as we speak with my assistant of mine, and who I know is watching. And It's interesting because what I've been realizing is that psychopathic traits are very easy to mistake for leadership traits. Probably a long time ago, the guy that could go out fearlessly and like rip a mastodon to pieces would have been very attractive. I think that for this reason, there's a great danger of people becoming hooked on love partners that are violent, or even political figures throughout history that are psychopathic or sociopathic, because I think we mistake that for this person's going to take care of me. And if they're a bad person, I don't really care because they're taking care of me. As long as they're on my side, I don't care that they're ferocious. I also think, looking at the research that's been done in preparing the article, is that it looks like people fall into different categories. I mean, you have people that are themselves victims, that are attracted to the idea that there's masochistic fantasy that I'm involved with somebody who could hurt me, and this time I'm going to master it, because this person loves me. I'm the exception. They won't hurt me. There are some people who are narcissistically fascinated that they are going to be caught up in that famous criminal's story, right? There are some people who have the idea, what a perfect love partner, a guy who isn't going anywhere. I don't have to actually have relations with him. He won't know anything I'm doing on the outside. I don't have to do very much for him to idealize me because I'm the only woman he's got. And so I think there's a little of that idealized partner. And and then I think there's a subtype that the assistant and I, my assistant and I have been realizing is that there's also this kind of psychotic type where you develop this kind of erotomanic fantasy that you have this special relationship with this offender that doesn't exist. You also have offenders that get so hybristically, someone gets so hybristically attached to an offender that they commit their crimes with them, right? Like Carol Fugate and Starkweather running around committing crimes together, right? Where you have this kind of insecure person who's got unpredictable relationships and feels negatively about themselves, and now this kind of hotshot psychopath comes along, and says like, you're on my side, honey, and then like you go out and you commit all these terrible crimes together, that I think is probably very exhilarating. In fact, when the hybristophilia was first defined, they used to call it Bonnie and Clyde syndrome because of the relationship between those two, right? And so yeah, there you are, the Bonnie and Clyde subtype, as somebody points out. So I think the article, we're going to be writing it for Psychology Today, and I think it'll be interesting to look at this a little more in depth and see what people think. But yeah, that seems to be the
I love
plethora of reasons why people get. Yeah,
I love this question from Vivi. Why retaliate against innocence rather than the end of life of the person who offended them? Interesting.
I love that question. That question gets right to the point about that this term I use, the prototype. So we could both talk about this notion of, there's the original person that hurt you, but then you go out and you find a fantasy victim to play out the offense. And the question, which I think is a very clever one, is why don't you just kill the original source? And my sense has been, and I'd love Anne's thoughts on this, my sense is the whole point is they make you feel powerless. The whole idea is you have to go out and find somebody that you consider to be capable of manipulation and so forth. And I think in the end, they do sometimes come around and kill the original type. Kemper did.
Yeah, Kemper
killed women that were right. Wouldn't you say, Anne? I mean, he came back around and finally killed the woman that was the true.
Right, we killed his mother. Right. And I think at one point he said, I think somebody asked him, what if you had killed her first? Would that have ended your killing spree? Which is always interesting.
Yeah.
Well, one of the answers to that question is the person still has control over them. So it's kind of the flip side to the powerless issue. That
It's a great point.
They still are afraid. You can't do it.
Right.
Interesting.
Right.
And so Linda asked, does the relationship with a mother play into this?
Oh, yeah, I think it does, because that's the first relationship of an infant has and growing up, of a mother figure. Doesn't have to be the biological mother, but somebody that they bond with. Yes, that's very, very important. And then what it can be, depending on the mother, of course, it can be the source of the rage, which is in the Kemper, we just said, in the Kemper case, the rage was at the mother.
Yeah, I had Brandon Wilson, who killed Matthew Checky in the bathroom. He told me that when he was 16, he stood behind his mother with a knife, and he wanted to kill her, but he just couldn't get the courage to do it. So, but okay, the next question. We're almost done with questions here. So, how does heroin, and Gary, this goes into your research.
Yeah.
How does heroin drug addiction fit in, though? I still can't quite make sense of that.
Well, first of all, I don't know if the person asking the question is talking about Kohberger, but I sense that is what they're talking about.
Yeah. Yes.
And
Yes.
it's a little bit complicated because we don't really know the timeline of if, for example, there was some relapse into drug use or anything like that. But what it is that if you look at research on people who have histories of drug use, is that even in periods of giving it up, there can be long-term effects on frontal lobe and areas that have to do with inhibition and all that. There can be effects on like dopamine pathways and the kinds of things that people are afraid of or are thrilled by, certainly with the capacity to pay attention, remember things and things like that, and organizational ability. So that, a person who has a history could certainly, and I think commendably, go into a life of putting that behind them, but there can be effects that are long term. And I think what you want to think about is, when people use that, sometimes what you see, I don't think it's universally true, but sometimes what you see is that this is a person's way of kind of like dealing with things. Sometimes when everything is falling apart in their life, and sometimes it's when things are okay and it's really hard to kind of bind it and hold it together, and it feels like it's going to fall apart and they don't have control. And what you could see in some people is that the substance and alcohol use is no longer there as a coping mechanism. They might need something else to serve that function, to have that, to be that thing that kind of binds them or binds their anxiety or their, and it's really interesting. Like, I have found that some people who have a history of use become completely and totally obsessively fixated on something that becomes the be all and end all of their existence, so that if they have control over that thing, they can bind their anxiety and so forth. I guess what I'm getting at is, I could picture Kohberger, if he is the culprit, using substance use as just another way to kind of cope with these difficulties that he was having, and that I think it was replaced by something else later, which is asserting control and so forth in other ways, and having that same feeling, if this isn't being fed by my experience, I'm going to fall apart, and then I have to reassert. We also know that from studies that people who kill serially look a lot like people with addictions. Brian Fallon has talked about that there may actually be hormones in the amygdala that are released when a person kills, and they look an awful lot like a person in that post-substance use phase, where there's a euphoria and a feeling of release and a spring in their step and all of that, and then regression to the need. But I, again, this is not exonerating, but I think it is interesting to think about the addictive quality for serial offenders. Wouldn't you say, Anne, for some of them, it's like a drug addiction?
Well, it absolutely is. Yes, I would agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. and we don't know how the wheels are greased in
Right.
terms of altering pathways and setting a person up.
Yep.
And some offenders use as a way to go at, like right before they kill, they need to do it. Like Bundy would drink,
Yeah.
so that's the other thing. Some people need it immediately. Some people, there's a
Right.
history of it. We don't know how it affected their brain.
Interesting. So, Dr. Ann, you kind of weighed in on Alan's behavior and confession. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm just thinking of the cases where they've had false confessions and whether that has been a part of it. I really want to know more about that. And he certainly seems to be deteriorating in jail. He's just, they need to do something.
So,
And
Lady Chan,
malingerers, Chris. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. I was just going to say, malingerers have very specific ways that they tend to fake being disturbed.
Yeah.
And there are instruments that can be used to determine if someone is malingering. It's a very standard evaluation. But there are symptoms, for example, like it's very hard to fake, like flat affect, right? That you might see in a person with schizophrenia, which the defense says may be going on here. We also know that schizophrenia starts when people are teenagers or in early adulthood. You should see evidence of that going back a long way if that's going on. It would be one of the first things you'd want to know. The other thing is that when people fake psychotic symptoms, they tend to fake ones that are very rare, like visual hallucinations. The devil is appearing and handing me a blade and saying, kill these people, or they act totally disorganized or bizarre. The reality is that there, people who have a lot of experience, like myself, that go in and evaluate these people, there are certain symptoms that you would say, that's not what you would think to fake.
Right.
And as a final point that I didn't mention earlier that I think is very important is this new document dump that came out on Alan. If you read it, he was very cooperative. He was very happy to say, this is where I was, this is what I was doing, this is the time it was, this is what I would. He was not doing that covering and faking and scheming that would match somebody who staged a crime scene. He was almost too cooperative. Here, come, go ahead, go in the house. There's my guns. There's my, whatever. And I just think that is more consistent with an impressionable person who I think you have to do a proper evaluation. But I think we should emphasize, and I think you'd agree, we're not saying whether he's guilty or not. We're simply saying there isn't enough info.
Right.
I think it would be reasonable. But anyway.
Any ex-girlfriends come forward that we know of for Bryan? No, I don't think there have been any. I know there's been dates that have come forward. I know there's reports, and I don't know how much more.
There was a woman that he had a very close friendship. Well, not close, but a friendship with, who was someone he was using with, that he was able to have a kind of connection with, and she passed away. I don't know what kind of effect that would have had on him, but I believe she passed away, and I think that's probably a pretty seminal event for him. And I think there was certainly the Tinder date, but the point we have raised that I think is you really want to think about is, if we're dealing with somebody more likely to move into serial offending, who would have had a kind of prototype in mind, you want to look at the victimology and what is in common between these victims, and if they kind of look alike or have qualities in common. Like, I would like to see one day the woman where he finagled himself allegedly into the dorm room, and was able to set up camera, or an ability to watch her. A woman that he supposedly liked at school, who maybe wasn't interested in him. And compare them to, the Tinder date when she was younger looked kind of like the victims. When she was older, she looked a little different. But if you look at pictures of her from the time of the date, she looked conspicuously like the people that he seemed to target. So that's the other thing is this a kind of a Bundy situation where you keep going out looking for this person that looks a certain way, and then you fixate on them. I think we really want to look at the pattern. And what you say in the victimology, the physical appearance is important.
Very important. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Right.
So the Amazon purchase, I know you had long before it was revealed. you had information about this, and that it was confirmed as evidence. Not only did Dateline confirm it, they have some information that it definitely was purchased, and so I don't think they're going to go out there on this one at a long stretch like this anyway, and tell the 72 million viewers that, oh, by the way, we can confirm today that he bought this on Amazon. So I would say Cholo, Cholo, that it's out there. I mean, they put it out there, and I'm sure it was vetted by a team of attorneys before they made that statement, or else there'd be a lot of lawsuits coming that way. I'm going to answer this one. Can the age of blood be determined how long it's been there? Well, Gary, I mean,
you should answer that.
Yeah. Well, yes, you can. You can determine based on how it dries in relationship to the pattern of it, how it's drying, and you can pretty much determine how long it takes based on the humidity and the heat and all the other the factors within inside of a room. And then you can also see, the directionality and what we call, blood spatter analysis. And there's a lot of tools today that even make it a lot easier. So to answer your question, Mimi, yes, it can be. And now once it's totally dry, you can't tell. Once it's been sitting there for quite some time, you can't tell when it actually, started and ended, but you can tell where it originated in that place. So, okay, last question. And I'm going to use this question as my sign off as well. At the conclusion of this question, we're going to sign off, and I'm going to give both Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato the final word. And I think this is a really important question from Debbie. Having all this information hopefully helps us to protect ourselves and others. And so I'm going to dovetail another piece of that. What can we tell our audience, or what can we tell the world? Because, we talk about some pretty scary stuff here in true crime. And Anne, you've been studying this. I mean, and guys and gals, if you've never watched the show Mindhunters on Netflix, get over there, because the character Wendy is based on Anne's work with the behavior science unit in the FBI. And she was one of the very first mine hunters with John Douglas and Ressler and all those many, many special people that set the use of behavior in crime scenes, where then you get guys like Gary who, also take it into what it looks like from the crime scene into the mind of the individual. And it's just a fascinating field of science. These are very well respected colleagues. They're colleagues. They're still working to this day on some amazing stuff. Please buy their books. If you haven't had a chance, get down, go into the link, purchase their books, because they are some really deep, fascinating information there, and it could save your life, in a lot of ways. And that's why they do this. They've been in this game for that very reason, why anybody gets involved, not only on the psychological aspect of things, but even in the law enforcement side of things. We go into this to help, not to hamper or to, make it more difficult for the human condition, but to help us all just kind of be a little bit more kinder to each other. And, hopefully that will move you to a better place. But what piece of advice would you give for the audience tonight? And when you are done, we're going to go to Hawaii. So I'm going to drop out here. You guys know my tradition. I love you all. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. And we're going to do this soon, but don't leave after the end. So I'll come back in and off camera, and we'll chat a little bit. Okay, so I'm out, and whoever wants to start, go.
Okay.
And please.
I'll start. Sure. I think it's very important that we do this. I know I do this, and I know Gary does. Is what can we learn from this that is protective, not only of ourselves but of all people, our loved ones, as well as other people in society. So I think that that's really, really important. And these are scary cases that we've looked at tonight, and especially the Idaho case. I think that women often think, well, if they have a big, strong guy with them, that he can protect them. And in this case, it didn't. It didn't protect one of the young women. So that has always been a scary thing, if you will, for me. So the advice is keep your antenna up, that you need to be aware of the dangers in situations. Don't override your antenna or your danger signal. Remember that one case where the young man said, "Oh, I want to invite Kohberger to the party. You know, he seems to like it," and the wife said no. And he luckily listened to her, but she had picked up something that was not all right in the situation. So from that standpoint, and the other is, of course, is to see if you are aware of somebody that you're really concerned about that is giving out some red flags. See if there's some way to get that person to see a mental health professional, someone that is aware of this kind of work. There's not a lot of people in this field. So you need to get a Dr. Brucato to at least give you a reference or a referral to who can you refer this person to. So that's my advice: is keep your antenna up. Always know where you are and what situation. If something awful happened, what would you do? Where would you run? Where would you hide? That kind of thing. I'll turn it over to Gary now.
Well, first of all, I just want to take an opportunity to say that, as I've been saying for some days now, that the 23rd of the last month would have been the 20th birthday of Abby Williams, one of the Delphi victims. And it really got me thinking about the end of adolescence and the transition to adulthood and that victim and all the things that she could have been. She was, for example, somebody that showed a lot of promise as a musician. And so I just sort of want to use her as a kind of a way, certainly both of the Delphi victims, as a way of just kind of remembering that we do this really to prevent that it's not about fascination with the killers or anything like that, but really just about, I think Anne would agree that if we were responsible in some way for somebody being captured before they took one more life, and that terrible ripple effect of what they do to the families and multiple generations, it would all be worth it. It would be a life well spent. And so just before we say anything else, I think we just to pause a moment and think about that is very, very important. And I'm sure Anne would echo that it's all about the victims for both of us. Now, I'd say I think Anne's point is very well taken. Remember that the reason what people like us do is we formulate statistics and patterns in violent crime to help target some of the anxiety that we all reasonably have about violent crime by being able to say, maybe if we could figure out that there are dynamics and ways of predicting and so forth, maybe one day we could prevent. So that the point is, in a way, there's nothing new under the sun. If your antenna kind of tells you that something is a little bit off, maybe that means something. And maybe a person who is showing certain behaviors or saying certain things or watching a certain kind of pornography or doing certain aggressive acts, maybe they do fall into the pattern of what it is that people like us show you should be worried about. And I think it's always good to err on the side of caution. Talk to a professional about it, have it assessed. If you have, for example, a partner who is asking you to do things that make you extremely uncomfortable, or you walk in on them watching a certain kind of pornography that's very strange, or a child in the home tells you that the person said something or did something that sets your hair on end, or the person is writing or saying things that sound very violent, don't rationalize it and say, That's not what happens to us. That's what happens to people on the news. But the people in this household, they don't do things like that. I think it's important to kind of go with your spidey sense on those things. And I think what Ann is saying is 100% true. I mean, there's a reason evolutionarily that we have that kind of barometer in us that says this person's creepy. You know, this person is, stay away from them. And you know what the tragedy is, for example, of the Kohberger case, if he's guilty, that all those people thought he was odd and scary and creepy, and it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because he turned out being somebody that was pretty scary and dangerous, and probably partly because he came to view himself as somebody that the world saw that way. But anyway, just so my take-home point would be, think about patterns, statistics, read up, educate yourself, and when you see a sign that matches that stuff, bring it to a professional. And wouldn't you say, as we're ending here, that in a lot of these cases, there probably were signs, certainly with Kohberger.
Yes, definitely. Certainly with Kohberger, and we probably would find them with Murdaugh and any of the others that we really looked at. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Well, it's a pleasure and always a great delight for me to work with Ann and Chris. The pleasure is ours, and we wish everyone a happy 4th of July weekend.
Happy 4th of July.
Bye-bye,
Very good. Bye-bye.
Off we go to Hawaii.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.